several years ago, we started a project advocating for youth with disabilities, youth whose cases had been court diverted. And so we've been working over in the juvenile court in diversion. And we learned that many of the youth are not getting services through their educational institution, and or if they were getting services, the services weren't necessarily appropriate. So we started seeing that what was happening is for these youth with disabilities, rather than getting services, they were being fast-tracked into the juvenile justice system. And so we saw our role as pushing back on that push-out at that point in the system. And then as we saw the effectiveness of this pushback, we had to ask ourselves, we're pushing these kids back to what? Are these schools really doing for the kids what they should be doing? And if we are spending our energy pushing kids back into another institution, then that institution needs to be functioning in a way that builds the kids rather than sets them back into a path of incarceration. So at that point we embarked on advocacy work in the public schools, particularly around restorative justice practices, in an attempt to create a culture of care rather than a culture of control and containment. And I see this as ultimately the struggle that we're engaged in, the struggle for our humanity. That when we look at society, we can see all of these institutions are interconnected in so many ways, and that for some people in society, the way institutions interconnect creates a net for them, wind at their back, a way to push them towards being successful. And for other people in society, for other kids, the way the institutions interconnect, whether it's housing, education, the economy, we can go on, the way these institutions connect creates barriers, challenges, and ultimately pushes these kids on a pathway to prison rather than a pathway to hope. And so I want to welcome you all as we continue to explore ways to create hope, to create that pathway to end mass incarceration, what I see as a slow-moving genocide in this country. I welcome you all, and I'm going to turn over the mic now to Betsy from the Juvenile Justice Initiative. Thank you.
So, welcome everyone. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Roosevelt University. I'm Betsy Clark of the Juvenile Justice Initiative, and I want to draw your attention to this extraordinary setting. We were so thrilled when Heather and Nancy said that we could have this summit here, because this building was completed in 1890. We, of course, in Illinois, pride ourselves, and we just convinced our UK speaker that, in fact, it's true, that we are the home of the world's first juvenile court in 1899. And so we're here in the spirit of that incredible progressive time when, without any research, just because it was the right thing to do, we set up all these laws for public education, for children, and the juvenile court. And that progressive movement, I hope that spirit, we can catch some of that today. The other interesting thing is that one of our speakers traveled across from the UK to be here. She works in London. And back at the time of the setup of the juvenile court, Jane Addams, just prior to that, had set up Hull House. And she had modeled it on a settlement house, Toynbee Hall, that she had seen in London. There was a great deal of back and forth and collaboration at that time, and so it's very fitting that we continue that spirit of cross-Atlantic collaboration here today. Roosevelt University, this extraordinary university, its strong commitment to social justice. There's a poster up in one of these hallways with a quote by Eleanor Roosevelt: "When will our consciences grow so tender that we will act to prevent human misery rather than avenge it?" I think that's a wonderful quote to start today's session with. Now, I want to draw your attention to the handouts here today. You have over on the right the agenda and the bios of the speakers. You also have this report that is just being released today, Young Adults in Conflict with the Law. The author, Kanako, where are you? Okay, Kanako Ishida back there. Extraordinary report. She was able to get data from the Cook County Jail. But please read this while you're here today. Particularly take note of the fact that in 2013, Kanako found there were nearly 12,000 admissions of young adults 18 to 21 in the Cook County Jail, that 8-square block prison complex, horrible, nearly 12,000, and of those a quarter, over 4,011 young adults were admitted to Cook County Jail for misdemeanors. Now that's our target here today, 4,000 young adults going in that awful, huge prison complex for misdemeanor offenses. So please read through that. Kanako's here all day if you have any questions about that data. And then the other thing you have is a fact sheet on House Bill 172 that's before the Illinois General Assembly now. That would restore judicial discretion for the critical decision of trying our children in the adult court. That's going to be heard in committee next month, House committee. And there are petitions in the back as well that you can sign in to support that really critical change. The other thing is our Illinois legislature, this is very timely, they've set up a separate committee on young adults. First time ever, there's a committee on juvenile justice and there's a committee on young adults this spring. So this is going to be a continuing topic. As you know, this is the second in a series. The first young adult event was at Loyola last month, and that was a very thorough review of the research, the brain science, and so forth. So today we continue this discussion. I want to move straight into the panel here today, but first, before doing that, yesterday we took our London visitor through the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center. And then we drove her around the Cook County Jail. And then having thoroughly depressed her, we took her over to Little Village for lunch to meet Tierra, which was a little bit of an up. But in the Cook County Detention Center, we were given this booklet of writings by the children in there. It's an extraordinary booklet. And right in the beginning, I want to read you my time. Time keeps on slipping while I'm sitting in here tripping. There's nothing I can do. Just wait until I get removed. I'm sick of waiting, waiting, waiting while life stays going on and on and on. Maybe I'll wake from this nightmare. This is a nightmare, isn't it? So with those words, we'll start. And I'd like the first panel to please come up here. By the way, logistics, there's coffee in the back. This is back 100 years ago, they built it right. The women's restroom is actually on this floor. Go towards the back and to the right. The men have to go down one floor. Sorry for that comment. Please, this is very informal. We didn't build in a break. Please feel free to get up and down as you need to. So, for our extraordinary panel this morning, these people have all traveled to Chicago in February. Let's give them a round of applause. Not easy to convince people to do. So we have, our first speaker is Brent Cohen, who is from the Justice Department currently, And he was here about a year and a half ago. At that time, he was working in New York City on the Close to Home initiative, which was working to close the juvenile prisons in upstate New York and bring the youth back to smaller group home facilities in New York City so they could be closer to their families. He's since gone on to a White House fellowship and now is detailed at the Justice Department working on young adult issues. So this is what our federal government has to say at this point on the young adult movement. Brent?
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you, Betsy, for that generous introduction. Please forgive me, I'm going to stay seated here since I have prepared remarks in front of me rather than at the standing mic. It really is an honor to be here this morning, and it's inspiring to see this many people in attendance on a February morning in Chicago. Justice-involved young adults are a population that until recently were not even considered worthy of their own conversation. Events like this one will help to change that. And for that, I extend my sincere gratitude to Betsy and the folks at the Juvenile Justice Initiative and to Roosevelt University's Mansfield Institute for Social Justice and Transformation, and to all of you, the justice practitioners, academics, advocates, government officials, and engaged citizens who are going to make change happen. I'd also like to recognize Carol Mason, the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Justice Programs at the Department of Justice, my boss, for really engaging in this issue and getting behind this work, as well as folks like Larry Steinberg and Vinnie Schiraldi, my former boss, who have helped to build momentum in this area. So we have a responsibility to align policy whenever possible with the underlying science. And that's where we really need to start this conversation. I know there was a previous summit that really delved into the brain science with young adults. I'm going to touch on it for just a little bit because I think looking at what the science tells us about brain development has to be the starting point, and that's where our conversations need to be grounded. Recent and not so recent advances in developmental and neurobiological research confirm that brain development, specifically the prefrontal brain systems, continue to develop well into a person's 20s, with 25 typically thought of as the age of full development as a sort of rule of thumb. During young adulthood, the part of the brain that controls pleasure seeking has largely developed, while the part of the brain that governs impulse control and decision making hasn't. And so essentially what you have, young adults, and I mean this with absolutely no disrespect whatsoever to young adults in the room, but young adults are overly motivated by reward seeking. It's brain development. And so what this means is that young adults are more susceptible to peer pressure, more prone to risk-taking behavior, impulsive behavior, and more likely to misread social cues and drastically overreact. And all of those things can lead to criminal activity, minor and not so minor. And so studies, including the Pathways to Dissidence study, which is the longest longitudinal study ever done on adolescents with serious criminal offenses, suggest that there is a natural aging out process, during which time young adults, young men in particular, stop engaging in criminal behavior. Individuals who have experienced trauma during their childhoods are likely to experience this aging out process later in life because trauma can interrupt that process, or at least delay that process. And I'll note, incarceration, whether at the juvenile or adult level, also delays and interrupts the aging out process. And this really shouldn't be a shock to anybody because incarceration, whether warranted or not, whether necessary or not, is a traumatic experience in and of itself. We are taking young people away from their homes, we're putting them in an unnatural environment, and so we shouldn't be surprised when natural developmental processes are interrupted by an unnatural environment. So what does all of this information really tell us about brain science and adolescent development? What does it have to do with the justice system, right? How do we marry these two things? Well, there's broad recognition that children and adults are different, and they should be treated as such when they make mistakes. The folks who created the first juvenile court right here in Cook County back in 1899 recognized those differences and they acted on it. And the Supreme Court in their decisions, most notably Roper v. Simmons, have affirmed those differences. But Jane Addams and her colleagues, they didn't have access to the information about brain science and adolescent development that we have today. And so with the benefit of 100 years worth of scientific research, I would venture to guess that if Jane Addams and Julia Lathrop and Lucy Flower had the benefit of this scientific research back in 1899, 18 would not be the age of juvenile jurisdiction in this country. And we have the benefit of that research now, particularly with the last 2 decades worth of really significant advances in this area. 18 was an age based on past cultural norms, not science. It's now just an arbitrary number at which to determine the transition into adulthood is complete. And this transition, which later became known as adolescence, in fact, I think that term popped up in 1904, so about five years after the juvenile court was founded. And from what I understand, Jane Addams and her colleagues had a significant, were significantly involved in the development of the term adolescence. That transition, if we looked at it now, it would continue well into the 20s. And I think through this work around young adult justice and justice involved young adults, we actually have the opportunity, much like Jane Addams and her colleagues did, to redefine or for the first time define this period of young adulthood. I also want to pause for 1 second and say, as important as it is for this brain science to exist and for us to be able to point to it, particularly in my job trying to do policy, to be able to point to something and say, hey, look, this is what science tells us, a lot of this is really common sense. And anyone who's ever been on a college campus knows that 18, 19, and 20-year-olds don't always make good decisions, right? And sometimes they make decisions that no fully developed, older, well-established adult would ever consider making. And so I don't know why we sometimes act like this is shocking all of a sudden when we're dealing with justice-involved young adults. The science is there, but it's also, quite frankly, common sense. So I've nearly exhausted my knowledge about brain science. But I have one more critically important piece to share with you all. So far, we've talked about the negative aspects of, I don't know if negative is the right word, but we've talked about things like peer pressure, risk-taking behavior, impulse control problems. But there's one more critical aspect. Because the brain is not fully developed during this period of young adulthood, the brain is also more malleable to appropriate interventions, right? We can actually encourage positive brain growth during this period of young adulthood. So we have this incredible opportunity in front of us, and I would argue that by lumping young adults into the adult justice system up until this point, we have been squandering that opportunity. And without accounting for that critical developmental difference, we are really missing out on an opportunity not just to impact these young people, but to impact our entire communities and our entire society. Because as much as this information is about the individual young person that comes in contact with the justice system and our moral imperative to help change their life trajectory, this is perhaps even more so a conversation about public safety and our public safety obligation to provide ourselves and our neighbors with the very safest communities to live in. And what we now know through recent advances in brain science that we just talked about is that by providing appropriate interventions at the right point, we can actually not just improve young adults' decision making, but reduce future criminal activity. And what that directly translates into are fewer future victims. And so we have this incredible opportunity not just to help the young person on an individual basis, but to help us ourselves on a much broader basis by taking a more developmental approach to young adult justice. The question then is, how do we do this? We often think about reforms at the back end of the system. Specifically, we'll talk about corrections and reentry oftentimes when we start talking about the adult criminal justice system. And you can see that they are clearly up there. But if you take just a second to look at this, and I only have 2 slides. This is it. But on this second slide here, you'll see there's arrow points at the post-arrest stage, at the court process stage, at the sentencing stage. And then, of course, there's the post-sentence and the reentry part. And all those parts are important, but the point that I want to draw here is that we don't need to wait until corrections. We don't need to wait until a probation sentence or a prison sentence or a jail sentence or until they're coming back into the community through reentry to begin to act in more developmentally appropriate ways. There are, in fact, ways all along that continuum, and I didn't even address the police interaction or the pre-justice involvement. I'm just starting at post-arrest on this particular screen. There are opportunities for intervention all along this continuum. And so I want to give you a few examples. And these that are up here are certainly not exhaustive. But in New York City, where, as Betsy said, I was before I went to the federal government, our probation department has the unilateral authority to, with victim's consent, divert a young person's case from ever going before a judge. This is specific to juveniles, right? So you have to be, in New York, 16 is the age of criminal responsibility, so 15 or younger. And the probation department was diverting 40% of the cases, just about 40% of the cases in a given year. That means those young people didn't get to the courtroom door. And there's some period of diversion. It could be 10 days or 120 days, depending on the circumstances of the individual and the offense for which they've been charged with. But there is a 90% completion rate of that diversion period in New York City, nearly 90%, which means that young people are successfully completing this period of diversion. Imagine if we could bring that to the young adult population. Swift, immediate, and appropriate accountability, but without the lifelong stigma of a criminal record. In the 5 months since I've been at the Department of Justice, specifically focusing on this population, I've come across pockets of innovation around the country. In Douglas County, Nebraska, for example, and if you look at that arrow where it talks about court process, it says young adult courts. Douglas County, Nebraska has a young adult court with a dedicated judge and a probation staff that works with 18 to 24-year-olds who have been charged with certain felonies. After completion of an intensive program, young adults can have their charges lowered from felonies to misdemeanors. Now, this may not be the model that works in every jurisdiction across every city across or every county across the country, but this idea of young adult courts with judges and prosecutors and defense attorneys and probation staff who are trained in adolescent, and you'll see at the bottom there, adolescent brain development training, could have a significant impact on how that court process works. We think about veterans problem-solving courts that we have, drug courts, we have different problem-solving courts around the country. There's no reason there can't be a young adult problem-solving court. In San Francisco, California, the probation department has really gone all in working with this population. They have separate caseloads for young adult populations, probation officers with special training, specifically in childhood trauma. They have a charter school on site in 3 of their locations so that young adults can continue to get their education. And a really critical point, and this is where we start talking about system change, is it's not just an opportunity for them to get education, which is critically important, but they can also earn good time off of probation by doing so, right? And so it's a different approach to probation, and it's specifically targeted towards young adults. And those are just 2 among many innovations that they're doing out there in San Francisco. And the DA, I would add, in San Francisco has also been engaged in these efforts, which is tremendous. In Maine and Pennsylvania, so starting to think about the back end of the system a little bit. In Maine and Pennsylvania, the Department of Corrections there have established separate prison facilities specifically for young adults that focus on age-appropriate rehabilitation, including cognitive behavioral therapy, life skills, education, job training. And so as we talk about the back end of the system and when it is absolutely necessary for a young adult, and I know that's even subjective in and of itself, but when young adults go to prison, that the programming be specifically targeted and rehabilitative in nature. And since I brought up prison, I want to just very briefly push the envelope just a little bit, because when it is that we need to use prison or some other correctional facility, jail, it needs to be to the benefit and enhancement of the lives of the young people that come into contact with it, rather than pushing them further down into a path of no return. And so there will be a natural inclination by many during the course of this young adult conversation, not necessarily today, I don't expect it today, but the broader young adult conversation, to make a distinction between young adults who are charged with or convicted of violent crimes and those charged with or convicted of nonviolent crimes. It's sometimes easier to split that out and have that conversation for folks. However, it's important that as we advance this conversation, that we advance it for all justice-involved young adults. The lack of impulse control and susceptibility to peer pressure may result in a shoplifting charge for one young adult and a robbery charge for another, where, for example, he or she forcibly takes a cell phone from a local adversary. Although manifested differently, the underlying science is the same between those 2 acts. Along similar lines, young people who have been exposed to traumatic experiences often react differently from one another. So while one young person may cower in the corner, become withdrawn, another young person becomes angry and acts out violently. Both young people are helpable. Both are treatable, and both can change. So just like we treat adults charged with assault differently than we would treat an adult charged with turnstile jumping, we need to take that same approach with young adults. But what we should not do is treat young adults charged with turnstile jumping as young adults, just to turn around and treat that young adult charged with assault as a fully developed, fully grown adult, because the science between those two is the same. So if we're serious about moving towards a system that responds to young adults in developmentally appropriate ways, we must do so across the board. Otherwise, we will really be missing an opportunity to truly advance public safety. Now, coming from New York City, I'm a little biased in some respects, and I shouldn't say New York City, but coming from a city government in general, I truly believe that change happens largely at the local level. It happens through events like this, through actions by state and local legislators, through policy changes by corrections directors and probation chiefs, and by the judiciary. But the federal government also has a role in this work. At the federal level, we are uniquely situated to elevate this conversation about justice-involved young adults into a national dialogue that is grounded in research regarding brain science and adolescent development. We're also in a place where we can diffuse innovation. There are pockets of innovation around the country in how people are dealing with justice-involved young adults. I gave just a couple of examples today, but there are many more out there. They are often small in scale, and sometimes it's even one judge who just particularly cares about this issue and has set up a separate calendar, for example. But it's an innovation nonetheless, and it could have promising practices for us. So as the federal government, we can lift those up and highlight them so practitioners around the country can take note of what their peers are doing. For the most part, these programs can't yet be considered best practices, often because they're too small in scale or don't have the evidence to support their work, but they are innovations in the right direction, and they can and should be highlighted. Third, speaking of that evidence, there's a third piece that the federal government is uniquely situated for, and that is to help develop the evidence in this area. We know a lot about what works in juvenile justice, and we know a lot about what works with older adults, but we don't yet necessarily know what works with young adults, because there really haven't been focused programming and evaluations on this population. And so we can help with that. And then finally, there's collaboration going on at the federal level. This isn't just a conversation that I'm having by myself, although I sometimes do talk to myself. These are conversations that we're having across the Justice Department, but also across our federal partners. Folks at the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Education. There's really an excitement to dive headfirst into this issue area. And so by collaborating at the federal level, we're hoping to encourage similar collaborations at the local level so that we can truly change the way that we think about serving this population. Before closing, I would be remiss if I did not mention how very fitting it is that we are having this conversation today, February 27th, as today marks the one-year anniversary of the My Brother's Keeper initiative. In February of last year, President Obama unveiled the My Brother's Keeper initiative to address persistent opportunity gaps faced by boys and young men of color and to ensure that all young people from all walks of life can reach their full potential. MBK is an all hands-on deck effort to tear down barriers to success. Businesses, community and faith leaders, foundations and other philanthropic institutions, local governments, and caring citizens have all responded to the President's call to action. By making our criminal justice system more developmentally responsive to the needs of justice-involved young adults, we are in a position to help change the trajectories of their lives. The work we are talking about today clearly contributes to the aims of MBK. We have our work cut out for us, but we are committed to doing this and working with all of you to hopefully achieve significant progress. Thank you again for having me this morning.
We're going to ask your indulgence and hold our questions until the full panel is over with. I do want to thank Brent, and I want to note the last time he was in Chicago was at the announcement by President Tony Preckwinkle that her role in My Brother's Keeper would be to try to end the automatic trial of children in the adult court. So thank you. Our next speaker continues this more than century-old tradition of work between the UK and the U.S., and Debbie Papard comes to us from a unique initiative in the UK, the Transition to Adulthood, that has been running pilot programs, just as Brent talked about, exploring the different possibilities for alternatives to criminalizing young adults in the UK. So Debbie, if you could explain a little bit about your background, and she has a wealth of information. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Betsy, and thank you so much for inviting us to present our evidence base today. It's been a really interesting visit for me. I've been here since Tuesday, and so I've had the opportunity to meet some civil society organisations and have a tour of the juvenile detention facility here, which was fascinating. And there's really, I think it's a great opportunity for us to just lay out some of the things, many of which actually overlap with what Brent was saying today. And we very much take the same approach of trying to gather good practice and generate it. And we're welcoming Vinnie Schiraldi on Monday over, so there's a bit of a conjunction there. So I work for the Barrow Cadbury Trust, which is a small family foundation in the UK. Our money came from the Cadbury family, and we're still governed by the Cadbury family, by the direct descendants of the founders. And if I can make this work. This is our founders, Geraldine Cadbury and her husband Barrow. Barrow was the chocolate magnate, and Geraldine, as you see there, very much, I think, the power behind the throne in a literal way. And she seems to be a very interesting woman. I think she was our Jane Addams, perhaps. And she and Barrow were very interested in the causes of problems, in addressing causes really at the structural end, and that very much speaks to what we still do as a foundation today. Geraldine and Barrow were very exercised by the plight of young people in Birmingham, their home city. And Geraldine actually set up the first youth court in the UK. And I've discovered she was pipped at the post by Chicago, which is good. And her court was set up in 1903 and became enshrined in our Children's Act. So what we do today is really in the tradition of Barrow and Geraldine. We try to influence structural injustices, and we do that through gathering an evidence base and enabling the direct voices of people influenced by policy, people affected by policy, to be heard. And we've got a particularly long history of action in criminal justice, and that's one of our main programmes at the moment. This will be a very familiar looking graph to you, and I'm not going to say much about it because I know you've had some presentation on that already, but it really just emphasises why we are interested in this young adult age group. About 10 years ago, the Trust did a consultation on where it should go with its criminal justice service. There was a lot of work in the UK on juveniles. There's quite a lot of general work, but very little focusing on this age group at which desistance can be achieved, really with a supportive environment rather than the punitive one. Our stats are awful. 75% of young adults being released from prison reoffend within a year. But there's excellent evidence that if you work with those young people rather than against them, there is a real chance of accelerating their development, accelerating the brain development that we heard about. There's been tremendous success in the juvenile justice sphere in the UK with reducing the numbers in custody from 4,500, which seem tiny compared to the numbers you've got here, to less than 1,000 today. So we want to replicate that with our work with young adults. As Brent says, this is not new. Shakespeare said, there were no age between 16 and 3 and 20, or that youth would sleep out the rest, for there's nothing in between but getting wenches with child, wronging the ancient tree, stealing and fighting. It was ever thus, even in the 17th century. And it's been repeatedly discussed in the UK. we feel at the moment there's probably the best chance of really changing things that there ever has been. The way that we've worked is to draw together an alliance. So it's actually, there's interesting similarities and parallels with the Juvenile Justice Initiative. We launched a commission of inquiry funded by the Trust in 2005, and that recommended the forming of an alliance of the main organisations working with young people in the criminal justice service in the UK. We've got a very different context in the UK because we've got a civil service rather than kind of political government management of some of these services. So this broad alliance was very helpful in bringing a lot of voices to bear. And the Trust, we fund organisations to carry out research, we fund pilot initiatives and evaluate them, and we also convene and support the alliance of members. And the lovely thing about having an alliance of members is that you can draw on a lot of expertise. So, for example, AdAction works with drug abuse, and the Prison Reform Trust, as the name suggests, has got a long history of advocacy for prison reform. And our initial manifesto, Lost in Transition, set out 10 recommendations for change. They were quite specific. They were about taking account of maturity, having better access to mental health, drug and alcohol services, better education, health and social care. So very much a welfare-based system that we were advocating. And we also thought that the policing of young adults should be improved, and that there should be a little bit more sophistication in identifying measures of success. So we recommended not just looking at reconviction rates, but looking at educational attainment, development of pro-social behaviours and that kind of thing, which has intermediary measures that show a developing adulthood. Early on, we commissioned a very helpful literature review that looked at the interaction between maturity, brain maturity, young adults and the criminal justice service. And this is an international literature survey, and if you're interested in this field, don't normally recommend people read literature surveys because they can be really very dry. Sorry, academic colleagues. But this is very readable and has got a lot of information in it. And all the things that you've heard already, and you heard at the last seminar about brain science, are brought out here. And the way that it was described by one commentator is that the developing adult brain knows where its accelerator is, but hasn't yet found the brakes. And I think that's quite a useful little sort of picture to hold in our minds. About 3 years ago, we remodeled our pathway, and that is extremely reminiscent of your arrow, Brent, but we went a little bit further back. So we've looked right back to the policing and arrest stages, taking people through diversion. In the UK context, diversion means diversion into mental health services rather than a more generalised diversion from crime, restorative justice, community sentencing, sentencing in the court, prosecution, mapping the transfer process. Transfer process is a very big issue for these young adults. The custodial estate, resettlement, and bringing the whole thing together to promote desistance. And what I'll do for the rest of my session is to just walk you through some of the evidence base that we've got. The first part of our work was really based on making the case for young adulthood, and we think that this has been largely made in the UK. There have been some specific guidance for young adults, and our senior government figures are now starting to talk about maturity being an issue. And apologies to young people about the language is awful of this, and I wish we'd never started talking about maturity, because we're stuck with talking about maturity. It feels rather insulting to young people. We need to find a new language, but I probably won't find that today. So, looking at the first step, policing and arrest, we've looked at some of the issues relating to policing young people, and the really big issues in the UK are around stop and search, so police stopping young people, Great ethnic disproportionality. If you're a young black person, you're 10 times more likely to be stopped at least than a young white person. It caused a great deal of resentment and problems. Policing the nighttime economy, where there's a shift from trying to pick people up and punish them to making sure everybody gets home safely, having had a good time. And also the challenges of having one group of young adults policing another group of young adults, and that can clearly have some training issues. We've recently moved in the UK to having political elections for our police and crime commissioners, who are the individuals who oversee the local police services, and that's actually the only politicised part of our justice delivery. And we've used that opportunity to develop the case for those police and crime commissioners for why young adults should be a focus. And that's for all the reasons that we've already heard. And we made 4 overarching recommendations. We suggested that they use a common sense approach. That's a very UK thing, a common sense approach to policing. That they should work in partnership with others to divert people away at the point of arrest. That they should take a lead, use their position as political leaders, take a lead with other services to reorganise services around this age group, and that they should engage with and consult young adults. We followed that up with an analysis of what they were actually doing, and we're now tracking 6 police and crime commissioners who are showing particularly promising practice. One of those is a police force in the West Midlands, in the Midlands, the middle of the UK, where they're reorganising all services. The Police and Crime Commission has got together with the sentencing, local sentencing council, the judiciary there, the young offender services, the local authorities, the health services, and they've put young adults at the heart, and they're doing a whole structural remodelling of services in that area. In other areas, there's a specific focus on commissioning mental health services. Of course, enormous numbers of these young people have got mental health problems. In another, there's a specific focus on consulting young adults in custody and in the criminal justice service more generally to find out what the issues are for them and try to address them. We are very mindful of gender, the different issues facing young women and young men, and we have commissioned a pilot project where all young adult women who are come into contact with the police and might be subject to an arrest, diverted to a community non-profit organisation. And that non-profit is also attempting to train the police in gender-aware policing, and I gather it's a very uphill struggle with some of the officers. But we'll do our best. Next, we come to diversion, and this is both diversion into mental health services, out of justice services, and also alternatives to moving people into arrest for things like restorative justice. 95% of our young offenders in custody have got a mental health disorder, and the transitions from the child and adolescent mental health services in the UK, of course state provided under our National Health Service, to the adult mental health service is also fraught. There's a bit of a cliff edge that people fall off when they get to 18. And what's really clear is that multiple transitions are a real problem for people. So while you're celebrating your 18th birthday and blowing out the candles, you're also losing a lot of services, and particularly, of course, those who are perhaps in care, in public service care. All that support disappears in a way that doesn't for young adults like me who had parental support at that stage. It's difficult to evidence a firm link between a poor mental health transition at 18 and subsequent offending behaviour, but it's not difficult to speculate that it would be the case. We know that relationships are absolutely key to desistance, and so if a large number of your trusted adult relationships, even though they're relationships with public services, fall away at 18, there's going to be a sort of scarring factor on that, and an increased likelihood of reverting to offending behaviour. A really significant barrier to better diversion in the UK is knowledge and training of police and mental health issues, and also an understanding of things like learning difficulties and autism that can present as difficult disruptive behaviour. It can be, we found a promising approach of co-locating services, so where a mental health practitioner is based in the police station, in the custody suite, we think that is a good approach. People can be screened out and diverted to services if need be. And we've got one project where we've got that co-location, so all young adults under arrest and held in police cells will be assessed by the service. Restorative justice in the UK is at the moment largely used with the under 18s, with the juvenile caseload, but we see absolutely no reason why it shouldn't be extended to young adults. In fact, we don't see why it shouldn't be extended to be offered to all victims, irrespective of the age of the offender. But we do think that maturity should explicitly be addressed in training, so that those who are restorative justice practitioners understand this brain science and can work with it. Interestingly, in the UK, we hardly use it with women, and we don't really know why that is. So again, in interest of gender equality, we're doing a little bit of work on restorative justice and women. Prosecution and sentencing. One of our first concrete successes, and of course a great celebration in the T2A campaign, was the inclusion of maturity as a mitigating factor in our sentencing guidelines. There's been a move in the UK to develop sentencing guidelines for all sentencers to try and get some kind of parity across the country. And those guidelines ask sentencers to consider maturity alongside a set of other factors like seriousness when making a sentence decision. And subsequent studies seem that it is the most common factor considered by our sentencers. Unfortunately, the downside is that we've got hardly any disposals available. So the impact of it at the moment, I think, is that perhaps the sentences are less harsh for a young person, rather than us really having a good range of more appropriate services available across the country. We want the same thing to be done with our Crown Prosecution Service when they're considering whether or not to take a case to trial. We've suggested to them that might be the case, and we think that we have got some prospects of doing that. Our new head of our Crown Prosecution Service is sympathetic to our agenda. The Crown Prosecution Service already needs to decide the level of maturity of a juvenile, so it isn't a big stretch to increase that to a slightly older age group as well. And we heard earlier on about practice in relation to sentencing, and we've got some court diversion schemes going on in the UK, in particular one which we're very interested in following up, where once the young person comes to court, a deferral of sentencing can be made so that the young person has a chance for referral to a drug treatment service, because of course, as in the US, drug offences are a huge driver of increasing prison population, and early days, but that looks promising. We have got a young adult specific sentence, only applies to young men, and that's for detention in a youth offending institution. And youth offending institutions are sometimes separate, or sometimes confusingly mixed in with older adult age groups. And there's just a very, very minor differences in how young adults are supposed to be treated in detention. But that is under significant risk for us at the moment. It's being diluted, and it's rather controversial, largely because the young adults, violence in the young adults, in the young offender institutions tends to be higher than in the mixed populations because of the nature of the young people. Community sentences, we've done quite a lot of work on this. It was a strong focus of our pathway in the early years, and we've completed our first full cycle of project pilot and evaluation. We ran 3 pilots here looking at different populations of young adults, so some who were considered to be low risk, one pilot working with people at medium risk, and one group of people at high risk who were gang-affiliated young men exiting prison. The common features of each of the projects is that the young adults could elect. They were voluntary for the young adults, so they could choose to join these projects, and they had their statutory intervention running alongside at the same time. And the voluntary element was very much based on the desistance model, so it's aimed at working with those young people, having a personalised programme, addressing their particular needs, and aiming to speed up the development of their brain and pro-social behaviour. And the really key thing that came out of that was the extent to which the young people valued that relationship they had with their worker. It wasn't just a supportive relationship, it was about challenging them as well. But there were some really simple things that those workers did. So they would text the young adult to remind them of a probation visit, for example. And that dramatically cut the breach rates for probation, so much so that one of our probation, the probation service in which this particular pilot was based, rolled out the thing, once our funding finished, has rolled it out across their whole service just on the cost savings of processing breaches. We evaluated those pilots, and that's all available on our website. We did a cost-benefit analysis and showed that you really didn't have to, these are very cheap services, you didn't have to reduce the offending rate by very much in order for the services to pay for themselves. We did a formative analysis, so we've got a good documentation of how the services worked, and outcomes analysis was very promising as well. It was really a sort of semi-quantitative evaluation of the outcomes, but we had a very low reconviction rate of a random sample of our young adults, and those reconviction rates were of very minor offences. A couple of other things, we translated the learning from those 3 pilots into our Going for Gold, which is guidance for probation services about how they might introduce that kind of service. And we also wrote a maturity practice guide for probation officers, which is has run off the shelf. We printed 12,000 copies, and they've all gone. So I think every probation officer in the country has asked for those. I talked about managing the transfer process. Transitions between our juvenile justice service and the adult probation service was very poor. And that was looked at very closely in one of our pilots, and a new protocol developed which was about making sure that case notes were it's not very complicated, making sure case notes were up to date, having a phone conversation with the receiving officer, and also where possible having a 3-way meeting, so the trusted adult relationship that had been built up with the young person could be handed over carefully to the receiving adult, and we think that helps to create a better relationship between the adult probation officer and the young adult. And that transition protocol has been developed into national guidance now by by the statutory services. We think that the transition between young offender institutes and prison needs care as well. I think that the nature of young adulthood is that you're really looking forward to being an adult, and we see a lot of bravado with young people in our young offender institutes. They can't wait to move to the adult prison, but the suicide rate when they get there shows that that's not all quite as good as it could be. Custody, we've done some studies of best practice in custodial settings, and this is a report from Professor Rob Allen, looking at countries where there is a specific regime for juvenile and young adults. The Nordic system, as I think we're going to hear, has got a really very much better service, very much more personalised, very much more normalised, and I think that normalisation is really key to this. So if you take, what we should be trying to do to prepare these young people for ordinary life on the outside. So the more that the incarceration experience can prepare them for that, and the more kind of normal it can be, the better. Clearly it has to be safe and people have to be contained and all the rest of it, but it should be all preparing for discharge. Resettlement and desistance, lots of work being done on what helps people to desist, obviously, and part of it is the maturing of the brain, part of it is developing ordinary adult things like a stable relationship, somewhere to live, a job, a family, ability to manage money, and a lot of the things that underpin a lot of our work is looking at how those things can best be provided. And we are also very interested in sort of how people's past stays with them. We feel that criminal records, for example, should be expunged, and people should be able to leave an offending past behind them when they become mature adults. Individual circumstances, I just wanted to include this slide because not everybody is the same. And one thing which we kind of came across by chance, actually, in a round table we had a psychologist there who'd done research on acquired brain injury, and a large number of our young people have got an acquired brain injury. So up to 60% of young adults in custody in the UK have got an acquired brain injury. So that's a brain injury which is bad enough to mean that they were unconscious for a while. And we know that repeated brain injury damages the frontal part of the brain and therefore makes people more impulsive, less empathetic, more at risk of committing crime. So we think that's an interesting thing to look at. Black and Muslim young people tend to do differentially worse in our system. I've mentioned that we've done very well with getting juveniles out of custody. We've done considerably less well with black young people than we have with the rest of the population. And young Muslim men, the prison population is shooting up. Young women have a particular profile, almost always highly abusive backgrounds that they've suffered. They've physical, emotional, and sexual abuse is largely in their history, and an exceptionally high incidence of mental ill health and self-harm, frequently in prison because they've committed crimes on behalf of other people. So they've shoplifted for their children, they've carried a gun for their boyfriend, they've perhaps been, there are other things that are really on behalf of other people. And we're in the process of setting up a second coalition to look at the needs of young women. I included a slide of international comparisons, not because I want to preempt our next speaker, just to let you know that we're about to launch, and I haven't proofread this slide, I'm very sorry, the jet lag kind of got the better of me, but the Germany and the Netherlands are our beacons of good practice in the UK. There's good evidence that the criminal justice response should be flexible, and by subjective we mean it should be, what we don't want to move towards is a kind of toolkit where you give people a score that you're 85% maturity or you're 20% or whatever. But the best jurisdictions take the picture of the person and say, is this a juvenile pattern or is this an adult pattern of behaviour? Almost all European justice systems accept that young adulthood should be reflected in laws or practice. The UK is still lagging behind, though we hope for better days. And applying a young adult specific practice will allow for this tailored response that will address the particular needs of young people, because people don't just, their brains don't just develop at different rates, but there may be different pattern as well. So some people will have a baby early, some people late, some people get a job earlier, some late, and it doesn't always happen in the same order. So my last slide, really the core principles. Maturation is a process, and it happens at different rates for different people. As we've heard already, we think there are multiple opportunities to intervene, and as you didn't start at the justice, we haven't started at school, and 5-year-olds, because that's really where the gains are to be had. Adolescents and young adults respond particularly badly to harsh punitive regimes, and we've all been adolescents, and we all know what happens when our parents tell us to do things. We really don't like it, and it isn't any different if the state tells you the same thing. Consistent, reliable role model relationships help help people's brains develop, and speed desistance, and we think this is where we should be going. Transitions are a big challenge and a risk. And my last point is, it's a social justice issue. Many of these young people are here because they've had difficult lives already. And it's our responsibility, I believe, as a society to try and redress those and not punish them because they're really acting out the experience that they've had before. So I think you can take your pick of the rationale for doing this. There's a good economic reason for it. There's a pragmatic reason. There's a common sense reason. There's a social justice reason. But a regime based on punishment is really conclusively proved not to work. And so really we might as well try something different. And we think that there's good evidence that this way works better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And all of these reports are on their website, which is an incredibly rich amount of materials on all of these different pilots and practices. Your website is?
t2a.org.uk.
t2a.org.uk. Now, while the transition to adulthood has been experimenting with this for the last 10 years, Germany, on the other hand, has been putting into practice juvenile sanctions for young adults since the 1950s. And we are very fortunate to have here an expert on comparative juvenile justice law who comes originally from Germany and came to us today from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where he teaches comparative law. This is his second time volunteering, coming down to Chicago to share his experience and his knowledge. Please welcome Dr. Ralph Grunewald from the University of Wisconsin.
Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Heather, for providing us the opportunity to all get together and think together about how to change the juvenile justice system. Thanks for the introduction, Betsy. So I hope it's okay that I stand because I lecture a lot and I can't sit on a chair and speak anymore. I have another couple of caveats. Alrighty. I got it. Better? Okay, good. Here we go. All right. So, couple of heads up or warning caveats. I have a German accent. I'm trying to get rid of it. It's not working. I will. Ready? All right. I feel like a stand-up comedian. All right. Okay. So I'll try my best. Okay. So first, the accent you have picked already. I'm not trying to get rid of it anymore. I live in Wisconsin. Everybody's friendly to Germans there. I mean, everywhere. So second, I might skip a couple slides because I have a few. So don't please feel rushed or anything. So sometimes I feel like when Julia gives me a warning, I just have to move on. But don't worry, I have it all planned out, and I hope to convey what I want to say. And third, there are going to be slides with data on them and diagrams and stats. I'm not a stats person, don't worry, so I just want to give you a warning and a heads up. It's coming. All right, so outline. Number one, first remark that I have to make is, as soon as we work in the comparative realm, we are speaking about different cultures, the American culture, the British culture, maybe the Wisconsin culture, the Illinois culture, and the German culture. And whatever I present to you is just, it's supposed to be in a non-judgmental way. So this is how a different country does it, and it might work for us because there are universal principles that apply to juveniles, but it's not that I'm on a mission here. What I would like to do is two things. In my first part, I think I should give you some foundation of the German juvenile justice system, unless you're aware of it. Do you know how the German juvenile justice system works? So I have some remarks, some background, how it developed, little history, and the general framework. And then I'd like to speak about how we introduce, how we deal with young adults in the German juvenile justice system. So a couple of remarks on the roots and the development. So the first juvenile court was actually established in 1908 in Frankfurt am Main in German, and it was modeled after the Cook County Juvenile Court, exactly. So Germans got inspired by that and picked up the idea and established the first court in 1908 in Frankfurt. And what happened afterwards was, after the war, people have been thinking about how to change the system and make it more adequate for juveniles. In 1922, we established the Juvenile Welfare Act, and this is exactly what Heather, you mentioned, I think, the term an ethic or a culture of care. This was very prevalent at that time. The positivism, the sociological positivism, the idea we can make a change in people, we can help people to get better, we can try to work on avoiding crime. This was very, very strong at that time. And this Juvenile Welfare Act was established. 1 year later, this idea permeated the criminal justice system. So people thought, well, you know, if it works for kids and maybe for those who have not a parent, we might introduce that idea into the criminal justice area as well. And this was the time when the Juvenile Court Act, there are various translations, you find the Juvenile Justice Act, Juvenile Court, whatever. I call it Juvenile Court Act, that's a literal translation from the German. It was established in 1923, which was a compromise between the more retributive, punishing ideas that existed before and the idea of an ethic of care. So when we look at juvenile delinquents, we might have some that where punishment is just what we have to do, and we might have others where more care or help is necessary. This Juvenile Court Act rests on 3 pillars. The first is it rests on, and this is literal, it's a literal part of the code, on education. The German word is Erziehung, which doesn't really cover, which is much more than education. Education is like, you know, what's education? It's like you go to school and you learn things, and then you go home and do your homework. But Erziehung is also child rearing, upbringing, cultural immersion, learning norms and values. This is the idea behind the Juvenile Court Act. It gave more discretion to prosecutors, partly abandoning a very strong principle, the principle of legality, which is for American ears a novelty. So in America, prosecutors and law enforcement have a lot of discretion. They can charge or not charge. In Germany, that's different. Prosecutors have to charge as soon as they see a crime, and then everything is in the hands of a judge. But the reformers thought, well, maybe for juvenile, that's not the best idea, because we maybe should keep them out of the system. We're speaking 1923, out of the system, because we know that the system and incarceration doesn't do them any good. So we want a prosecutor who is trained and has some knowledge on education, about education, to make a decision as to whether this young person should proceed into the justice system. And it also increased the age of criminal responsibility to 14 years. Let's pause here for a bit. It's 14 years still. So if a 13-year-old commits a homicide in Germany, he or she will not see a judge, will not go before court. There are social welfare agencies, there's all sorts of institutions that help parents who have maybe difficulties with educating, upbringing their kids. But this kid, a 13-year-old, regardless of the crime he or she commits, will not go before a juvenile court or any court at all. So this is quite a difference. So to give you some idea of the framework of how that code works and what it does, this is a photo I found on the web. This is how a regular juvenile court might look like. We have 1 professional judge, we have 2 lay judges, and as you see, we always have, that's by law, yes, it's by law, the lay judges that we don't have juries, always have to be male and female. Do you know why? Can you imagine why? Male and female lay judges? Gender awareness and parents. That's the idea, to have a representation of the parents who are also involved in the proceedings, who have even a say in what's going on, to represent them. So this is the setting. It varies from crime to crime. And here, so the framework again of the whole code is based on what we've known for a long time. And Debbie mentioned the Shakespeare quote. We have known for a long time that crime age distribution that I show here. So these are numbers regarding suspects per 100,000, not convicted, people? It's suspects. We have a database where police have to put in all the suspects that they find. And we see that we have the highest number of suspects at the age of, I can see it correctly, 14, 15, 16, and then 17, 18, then it tapers off. This is the natural progression, and this is universal. This is universal. This is in Germany, and this is the same in the United States and in the United Kingdom, everywhere. It's a natural progression because of the effects that you mentioned, brain development, lack of impulse control. And do I have time, maybe 30 seconds for a little anecdote, impulse control. So I'm teaching this large lecture on criminal justice in the United States. And one day, a student approaches me and says, well, you know what, Professor, I have to tell you, there are those kids, I take attendance, even in a large lecture, they are forging signatures for kids that are not there, students who are there, and I'm really bugged by that. I don't want this. Could you follow up? And I said, well, yeah, I'm not really like the law enforcement type of person, but I do. So I looked at the attendance sheet, and I saw it's clearly forged, and I had this other student. And it was on the day we had a guest presentation by the Assistant District Attorney of Dane County. So how much more law and norm do you need? And still, young adults are not able to, they would know, they know they shouldn't do it, but they do it anyway. So how much more do you need to understand that there's something going on with their brains? And I tell them, so this is the natural progression, it just tapers off. So if you look at this, I'll go back to this. This is what the German system is based off, knowing that crime naturally, people mature out of crime naturally. And you might already assume, so what would be the most reasonable, what would be a good approach to that? If we know that many kids commit crimes, in parentheses, petty stuff, shoplifting, whatever, what would be the natural approach? One approach would be, we just wait until it's over. And we try to cause not more harm by putting them into an institution. That 2 or 3 bars of chocolate that they stole, or let's call it whatever, an iPad, or whatever they stole, if we put that kid into an institution and label that kid, it does worse to society than it would actually then maybe letting it go, give them a warning, give them a whatever meeting with the judge. So, but I go back to that. Scope of the German criminal justice system, age of responsibility is between 14 and 18. It's the sole jurisdiction of the juvenile court. There is no waiver to adult court whatsoever. Every juvenile in the age between 14 and 18 will see for whatever crime a juvenile court and not an adult court. Between 18 and 21, young adults, the population we talk about today, sole jurisdiction of the juvenile court as well. Whether or not this juvenile judge will then apply adult law or juvenile law depends, and I will talk about on what it depends. And then even beyond 21, even if we have let's say a 20-year-old convict for some crime and he or she's incarcerated, which is rare, then he would serve his time in an institution for juveniles until he is 24. The idea behind that is juveniles and young adults need a different kind of treatment, which adult institutions can provide. So we have to provide them with opportunities for development and growth. All right. Actors of the juvenile court in the juvenile court are social workers, defense counsel, of course, and judges and prosecutors. And the judges, according to the law, should have appropriate education and training as well as experience in the education and upbringing of youth. So Julia asked me, so how does it actually work? And honestly, it's not that every juvenile judge has to take a course in pedagogy, education, social work, but they're picked. And if they have an interest in that area, they grow into that department. But that's the idea of the law from 1923. Substantively, how does it work? I don't want to bore you with dogmatics, but basically the same law, the same substantive laws apply to juveniles. The only thing that's different is that the punishment that the regular law, that substantive law provides for adults is sort of cut, and the Juvenile Court Act has its own interventions and measures that follow that kind of crime. Most due process protections, by the way, apply, so right to an attorney, but trials, for example, are not public. That's for the protection of the juvenile. But in most due process protections apply. Going back to the main goal of the Juvenile Justice Act, the main goal is Erziehung, mentioned throughout the code but not defined. It includes education, child rearing, leading a life without crime, care, I would say. And one of the core ideas which I argue, that's kind of, you see my humble contribution, I wrote about that principle of education in my PhD thesis. And the idea is to individualize sentences, to not take a shotgun approach and say, well, this fits everybody, we have uniformity, and every juvenile who does drugs and deals 20 grams of marijuana gets that sentence. We have to take an individual approach, and the same crime might lead to different outcomes in different juveniles. And the idea behind that is as well, less intervention is more. What interventions do we have? And now I have a scary slide, I have to warn you. So we have a delinquent act, and we have what's called informal sanctions. That's basically a dismissal and diversion. We call it diversion. Diversion is used in various ways in various jurisdictions. The German understanding of diversion is, okay, we have this kid, and we divert this person away from the juvenile court, from the court in general. And we might do nothing at all. We think maybe he or she will mature out of the whole thing, or we might have a condition, you have to attend some training or have to meet with a social worker. That's informal. And then we have a whole set of formal interventions that we can use. And here they are all. And you don't have to worry, you don't have to write them down, there's not going to be an exam, but there's a whole set of educational measures that we can use, disciplinary measures, there's also imprisonment, and all come with, depends on the state, various types of and kinds of programs that all have the goal of individualizing an intervention as good as possible and as efficiently for that particular juvenile. So diversion, informal intervention, formal court sanctions as well. And so now you wonder, well, how often do you use the informal and the formal? I know this looks horrible. It's a very simple kind of, what we see is very clear that most 70% of all interventions are informal. Everything below that red line are informal interventions. That's all diversion. Everything above is formal. And by formal, that doesn't necessarily mean kids go to prison. Incarceration is the dark blue line here, that part. It's maybe 2, 3, 4%, not more. Lighter blue is incarceration on probation, and then the other two are disciplinary measures and short arrests, that's all. So this is incarceration. This thin blue line here. Everything below the red line are informal. And as you see, the amount of informal intervention has increased since 1980. This is 1981, this is 2010, so it went up. Much of informal intervention. Because we know most kids mature out of their delinquent behavior. Now let's look at young adults. And everything you saw on that slide here also pertains to young adults, because this is the whole juvenile population that a court sees. So these data include young adults and juveniles. And for all practical purposes, the inclusion of young adults in the German juvenile justice system is basically a given. We have an inclusion rate, and I'll show you data, of maybe 80, 90%, depending on the crime. So most young adults, 18 to 21-year-olds, are included in the set of rules that the juvenile justice system provides. They were first included in the Juvenile Court Act in 1953 after the war. And the Juvenile Court Act, or the legislature, acknowledged the situation of what was called the fatherless generation. The fatherless generation was the generation of kids that grew up after the war who did not have, and for whether or not that idea was right or wrong, who did not have a leading force or somebody helping them to grow up. And so the state thought, well, we have to give them something to help them. Maybe the justice system should help the young adults that are suffering through a very difficult time in their lives. So it was meant, the idea was to include young adults in the Juvenile Court Act to pay respect to or to acknowledge the situation of that generation. But that law was kept unchanged because the legislature then later on, after I think 20 years we had a reform, and then in the 1990s I think we had 1 or 2 reforms. They all thought it's a great idea. We see the importance of educative intervention in young adults, so they kept it. So we have that since 1953. What does that mean? So young adults fall under the original and exclusive jurisdiction of the juvenile court over young adults. And juvenile court applies either juvenile or adult law, but it never waives cases to adult court. That doesn't happen. So it's a juvenile court, it's a juvenile judge, juvenile judges that apply either juvenile or adult law. But even more, but even if adult law is applied, then we have a couple of adjustments. So the severity of a sentence is 10 to 15 years maximum. So here we have, just think about it, we have a 21-year-old murderer where the judge thinks, and I will explain what triggers the decision as to whether we apply juvenile or adult law. We have a 21-year-old murderer, and the judge thinks, no, he's too young, he didn't know what he was doing, it was awful, but nevertheless, he is still a juvenile. Then the maximum sentence this person can get is 15 years. 15 years in prison. And this will probably, he will or she will probably get out much earlier, which is for, again, this is the cultural thing. If I tell this, my American students, I see jaws dropping, and they ask me, so how about retribution, and how about an eye for an eye? And this is the part where we need to have a conversation about what's the purpose of punishment, what's the idea of what we actually do, what is it we want? Do we want retribution? Is it all about like how we feel or how some feel better? Or is this about making society a better and also a safer place and making a much more efficient, creating a more efficient or financially efficient juvenile justice system? Even if they are incarcerated, the leading idea is normalization. And Debbie mentioned that the idea of normalization means that the life in prison should be comparable to the life outside. If we create a vacuum in which kids live and just stored or locked up, which has nothing to do with the life outside, it's very difficult for them to reintegrate, and reoffending is very likely. So normalization is one idea. They will be in a juvenile correctional facility until the age of 24, which sort of coincides with the brain science that Brent mentioned, that at one point, even males, 24, 25, the prefrontal cortex is fully myelinated and reaches adult levels. But when we look at numbers of incarcerated juveniles, only 10% are, when we look at those facilities, you will find only 10% juveniles. It's an objective to keep juveniles out of a detention center or out of prison. And so 90% are young adults. 50% of them have a migration background, which would be a subject for a different talk, but we also have specific ethnical situations in Germany that are reflected in our incarceration rates. So now you wonder, when do you treat a juvenile, when do you treat a young adult as a juvenile and when as an adult? I don't want to bore you with too much legal dogmatics. There are two things. So the law says you judge have to look at two things. Number one, is the crime that person committed comparable to what a juvenile would do? Is it youth misconduct? If you think it's youth misconduct, then treat him as a juvenile. Or do you think that this person you have in front of you was still equivalent to youth in terms of his moral and intellectual development? If this person, not the conduct itself, but the person, is comparable to a juvenile, you apply juvenile law. Juvenile personality, this is this part here. How do you define that? There are guidelines. We have psychological guidelines that include ask the judge to measure whether or not the young adult is able to autonomously judge what he or she does. Does he have enough emotion control, adventure seeking, etc.? Or we see youth misconduct. So what's youth misconduct? What are crimes that typically only juveniles commit? Joyriding, theft on a dare. Do you use that term, theft on a dare? Okay, theft on a dare. Graffiti. But it's not limited to minor violations. So there's one case in which a 20-year-old killed his 3-month-old baby because he couldn't stand crying, the crying of the baby anymore. Juvenile law was applied because the judge thought this is something that shows lack of impulse control, and therefore we apply juvenile law. And here, now, this is the assessment the juvenile judge does. And then, now let's look at the numbers. How many young adults are included? What's the percentage of the application of juvenile law to young adults? And we see this has been rising. This is 1955, right? At the beginning, 1953, 1955, and it's gone up, and we have an overall inclusion rate of, this is 2010 now, I would say maybe 70, 80, 90%. I don't have more current numbers, but I would say it's very high. So 80% of all young adults are treated as juveniles in Germany. That differs a little among the states. So we have what's called the north-south divide. It's more inclusion in the north and a little less inclusion in the south. And there may be political aspects that explain that. But basically, the average is still very high. And there are also differences in the inclusion of young adults according to different crimes. But you would think, maybe for more serious crimes, we have a lower inclusion rate. Judges maybe are less willing to give juveniles the benefit of juvenile law, or to give young adults the benefit of juvenile law. It's not the case. So here we have murder and manslaughter, 88, 89%. I think more recent data says that it's even higher. We have aggressive assault, 92. Oh, all right. Okay, thank you. Simple assault, 80%. We have, robbery, 98%. Blackmailing, burglary, all way in the 90s. Rape and sexual assault is around 93%. It's not on that graph. And we have simple theft. Here, simple theft is 70%. Fraud, 53%. Then we have a German term, which is like driving without, riding the train without, is it turnstile jumping, something like that, riding a train without a ticket, or going to the movies and just sneaking your way in. So it's some sort of fraud, minor fraud. We have, we see, wow, why is it 47? Traffic violations, 47. Why is it that much lower? Why are fewer young adults included or get the benefit of juvenile law when it comes to stuff like traffic offenses and maybe petty fraud? Why is that? Why are we tougher on, because Germans like their Autobahn, and so we are tougher on? No, because the reason is because we have, in adult law, we have what's called summary proceedings, or abbreviated criminal proceedings. So we call what's called a penal order. In order, if somebody commits a traffic offense, a hit and run or something, where we don't need an actual trial, a judge with a prosecutor can apply for what's called a penal order. That's like a conviction without the whole trial thing. It's very fast, it's very efficient, and gets the files off a prosecutor's desk very quickly. But you can only do this in adult law and not in juvenile law. And in order to get rid of the petty stuff, a juvenile judge might think, well, maybe I apply adult law. It's not a big deal, not a big stain on the record. So I get this off my table. I apply adult law because then I can get this case off more quickly. That's an explanation. Here's a comparison. How much time do I have, Julia? Do I have 5 more minutes? 5 more minutes, okay, almost 5, okay. So there's a comparative study, which I'm very happy to maybe send you all if you'd like, that compares the city of Bremen and the city of Denver in regard to the inclusion of juvenile and young adults. And I skip those slides because I only have 5 more minutes. So now you wonder, okay, so now you have this great inclusion rate, but aren't there also serious crimes and violent crimes happening in Germany? How about kids just, cutting their throats and things? Yeah, we have violent crime, but it's a very low percentage. And only 3% of all crimes in general are violent crimes. And 70% of those 3% are what we call dangerous, serious, violent street crimes. So dangerous, serious, violent street crimes is not that people run around with knives and guns. We don't have access to guns that easily. It's more, this all happens within the same peer group. It's kids running around and they're just, get into a fight. Very rarely we have a serious, opposed to what the term might signify, a serious outcome or damage. So it's just a matter of how the statistics are put together, and they use that term, serious violent crimes. which doesn't always mean it's a serious harm that is caused. So, and we saw an increase. We saw when we look at suspects, we saw an increase over the last couple of years. And does that mean the society is getting more violent? No, it just means in general that these crimes are usually committed within the same age group, which is supported by data on victimization. And these are all age-typical crimes without serious injuries, and the data do not support an actual increase in the crime rate. What it supports is what it shows is that the public has become much more sensitive toward violence, and there's a much more increased willingness to report. There's much more I could say about this, but just as one comment on whether or not we have an increase in violent crime and a big problem, and this does that stand in the way of including young adults? We probably don't have that. Recidivism. Well, okay, it sounds all good and nice, but if you include so many young adults, don't you have a problem when they come out of that whatever program? Not really. We see that informal reactions, diversion, not doing anything at all, to juvenile delinquency does not produce higher recidivism rates. Probation is as effective as formal sanctions. There's tons of data that proves that. And here's a slide that, I don't want to scare you with that. This is a study by Gertspies from 2012. It's a 3-year recidivism study. You see those 4 bars pertain all to general crime, adult crime, people who are older than 21, and this is all juvenile crime. What we see here is, and the way you have to read this is, for example, here, we have, if somebody is incarcerated with no probation, the recidivism rate is 48% in adults, and it's hard to see here, but I would say maybe 10%, no, it's 20% are incarcerated after the second crime they commit. I would say maybe 20% resulted in incarceration, and another, let's say 10% resulted in incarceration with probation, and the rest is another formal sanction. So here we have what happened. So a juvenile was convicted to incarceration without probation, and we see a recidivism rate of 30%. 30% are, again, incarcerated with no probation. And then we have maybe 20% incarceration with probation, and 66, and then we have here other formal sanctions. Now let's look at the lenient diversion or informal reactions. It's right here, diversion. So if you include the conviction to diversion, we have a 36% recidivism rate. But if you look at any kind of, does it mean if I divert a juvenile that he or she, that we are, that he or she, that the system kind of backlashes and say, well, you made a mistake. You gave this person diversion, informal direction, and now you have a serious criminal running around committing crimes? Not when we look at the data. We have a very, very low, you can barely see it here, 1%, 2%, 3% maybe, where somebody was diverted and then is incarcerated without probation. So yes, they come back, and some come back and they are informally or formally sanctioned, and the blue is they are again sanctioned to diversion, or the case is again diverted. This doesn't mean that we don't have persistent recidivists. The numbers are the same. The United States and Germany, depends on the study, we have 3 to 5% of all people commit 50 to 60% of all crimes, so-called persistent recidivists. Yes, and the system has to somehow take care of them and deal with them, but for the majority, an informal approach is very successful. And we see again, when you look at recidivism rates, that the younger you are, the quicker you, the harder it is to desist from crime. The older you get, the easier that is. The Bremen and Denver study I will just skip, but both studies found that arrest, time's up, okay, see, arrest has a counterproductive impact in the United States and in Germany, and that there is no evidence that treating young adults as juveniles has any negative effects. Diversion and non-custodial interventions for young adults are very effective, but we need to be culturally ready, and this is why I think and I hope we all here. And I thank you very much for your attention and bearing with me. Thanks.
Thank you, Ralph, very much. I want to just mention, Ralph talked about the normalization of the prison facilities in Germany. And there is a study out of the US, the Vera Institute, a couple of years ago, took corrections officials from Colorado, I forget where else, over to Germany to look at their facilities. And they were struck, there's a report if you go on the Vera Institute website, really struck by the difference in the culture and the facilities. And in Germany, there was, as he said, more normalization. People were going back to their families over the weekend. They were going out for school, for jobs, and then coming back in. There was more in and out, and the facilities themselves were much more humane. And so dramatic differences there. This is the point where you get to ask some questions. I think there's some mics. If you wouldn't mind lining up by the mic, people who have questions, and identify yourself, please, too. That would be good. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Delane Mayer. I'm an AmeriCorps member, and I'm not sure how the system is in the UK or Germany, so maybe this is a question for you, Mr. Cohen, but I'm curious how the US can have reforms in policy or legislation when politicians and other groups are so incentivized by the for-profit prison industry. Thank you.
So I think that's a great question, and I think it's really important that we look at the financial underpinnings of the system and what behavior may or may not be incentivized through the criminal justice system. That having been said, I think particularly on the juvenile side, you see a mass reduction in the number of young people, again, juvenile, so 18 and younger, some states 17 and younger, who are being incarcerated. And so I think while there's really, it's a very valid point and something we need to pay a lot of attention to, I think also the discourse that we're having now around the need for criminal justice reform is crossing party lines in a way that it hasn't in the past. I was reading recently, and I'll mess up the names of the organizations, but there's a collaboration between Koch Industries and the Center for American Progress coming together on some initiative around criminal justice reform. Two entities that you never thought would have ever collaborated on anything, and they're collaborating on this right now. And so I think there is this unique opportunity and this unique window in the United States around criminal justice reform that I just don't think we've seen before. And so I think there's really an opportunity here, specifically on the young adult stuff, but on reform more broadly.
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Sarah Youssef, and my question actually goes towards, I was wondering in terms of the German study that you had conducted, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the racial and ethnic disparity, or the immigrant versus non-immigrant disparity in terms of incarceration and punishments that they have. Is there any kind of study that or statistics that you have regarding that?
So you're asking, I want to repeat the question, you're interested in the ethnic or racial setup of the incarceration?
Yes, and diversion.
So I have not researched that in depth, but so what we see is that, and I pointed to that we have that there is a migration, or people with young adults with migration background make up 50% of the incarceration population, which shows that there is a problem. We have, and it depends on the study, and the few I know say that there might be a violence problem with some, I don't know what the English term for that is, those who are immigrated from Eastern European states very late to Germany, and there are at least some pockets where at least judges say we see a concentration of violence in those populations. Doesn't mean that it's the ethnicity that is violent, it's maybe that they're lacking the social support of establishing kind of strong roots in the community. But we also see, I can't say anything about arrests. I don't know studies that I would assume we have the same arrest biases and prejudice that we see in other countries. But for incarceration, I would think, I can't point to the actual causes of why we have a disproportionate incarceration of migrants, but I'm happy to look into it, and maybe if you leave your your name, I'm happy to send you a study.
Yeah, and I just had a follow-up to that. Are there any efforts that are being promoted to address that at all?
Oh yeah, of course. So this is one of the big topics in incarceration. I think we don't see the same disparity than we see in other countries, but it's there, and of course it's a big issue. And but I can't say much about the efforts that are made to what practically is done. But from what I know from my own training, judges and the whole judiciary is very aware of that and tries, of course, to avoid that.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Tarzia, and my question is, are there any studies on the impact of housing juveniles and young adults in detention versus housing these young adults with older, over 25 people who are incarcerated?
So the question is if there are any studies that look at how housing works, what happens, what are the dynamics if you house younger juveniles with young adults. There probably are. I'm not aware of that many. It's just there probably are. I have colleagues who work on that, but I'm not very familiar with their work. And so far we have, the idea is basically to have a wall between adults and juveniles and young adults. And as Brent said, in the system, and I find this over and over again, that the distinction between like before 18 and after 18 is a very artificial one. So what they look is at individualized approaches toward housing. So there are projects, for example, in Wiesbaden or in Mainz, where I went to school, where we have psychologists looking at, so what, regardless of the age, regardless of whether he's 20 or 16, what's the best housing situation for that young adult or juvenile? And they're put together in groups with maybe a similar set of, let's say, challenges or needs for training, and not so much divided by age and say 18 is the clear cutoff. But again, that's something.
As a follow-up, though, do you think it's better to house these young adults with other juveniles, or do you think it's better to house them with older 25, 35?
Oh, they're never housed with anybody who is over 25, 24. So even if there are young adults and get a very long sentence, they move. Once they hit 24, they move to the adult population. That's, I think, what happens, unless there are reasons to not to, but I'm not aware. That's I couldn't say anything reliable on that topic. But until then, they're up until 24, they're in a juvenile institution that tries to, as much as possible, individualize any kind of treatment. I don't know if that answers your question.
So I don't know of any studies in the United States. I think there is good reason to think, though, that specialized programming, rehabilitative programming, modified therapeutic communities, sort of all the things that we know need to happen for this population are less likely to happen when they're housed with a 45-year-old, right? And so I think that's, we've seen some of these innovations in a couple of places. Maine, for example, has done it. I haven't spoken with them, so I can't speak to what their model looks like, but I know it is rooted in a youth development, young adult development type of model specifically for this population.
In the UK, we've got a mixed picture, so there are some young offender institutes specific for young people 18 to 21, and in other institutions, they're all mixed together. And the problems are different. So in the Young Offender Institute, because people tend to be a little more volatile, and there can be some grudges and other things happening, there tends to be a problem with violence. But as Brent says, you can focus on the needs of those young people, whereas when they're diluted in the adult population, things might be calmer. But frankly, having a role model, the role models might not be very good role models for the older adults. And as you say, Brent, I think the critical thing is what you do. It's really, I think, impossible to provide the kind of regime that's based on development, education, skills development for a few young adults that are scattered among a bigger population. And often, of course, these young adults, they're on very short prison sentences. In the UK, average 2 years, 3 months is the average length of sentence. And some of the older adults are on very long sentences. But so what we would like to see would be smaller units, much more in line with some of the best models in Germany, where that much more therapeutic developmental approach can be taken. So we don't like either of our models at the moment. We don't like the young offender institution, and we don't like the mixing either. We want something completely different.
So my question is, I love the idea that we follow the brain science, and if you're keeping young people through the age of 24 in a juvenile system, then other institutions in the society also have to shift the way they're functioning. And so I'm wondering, if we look at that population, at any populations, we'll see a significantly overrepresented population of folks with disabilities, mental health concerns, issues. And I'm wondering what happens in Germany, say rates of illiteracy, so that we can keep young people out of the adult crim system, but where is the path to a full life, and how is that being laid out, or is really the concern to just keep them out and they'll figure out a path once they get past the 24-year-old age, or do you understand what I'm asking?
I think you're referring to the transition period after what happens after somebody gets out.
Yes, so like if we were to look at the U.S., we
Yeah.
can look at our juvenile population and we can say that, that reading levels are extremely
Yeah.
low. Rates of disabilities and mental health issues, treated or untreated or mistreated, are very high. And so if we are going to create a way to make a path forward for young people so that they can have a full life, a lot has to change in all of these other institutions.
Yeah,
as
that's
well.
true. So in many respects, the German system differs a little. And so the first is the mental health. Just to address that, the mental health issue is addressed early on. So even in adults, if we know that since the 1980s, 1990s in the United States, that prisons have become the de facto mental health institution because of the lack of funding. It's not the case in Germany. We have what's called forensic hospitals, forensic psychiatry institutions where somebody with a mental health issue is, instead of going to prison, he goes to that institution. It has a wall, it has a fence, it has, barbed wire, but it has doctors and psychiatrists. That's number one. So this is the first big divide and switch that we have. The second is during a prison stay, juveniles and young adults are supposed to learn something. So sometimes, and I've seen this, and this has been highly criticized, that judges who think, well, this sentence, this crime maybe deserves 2 years in an institution. However, I put a little on top of that because in 2.5 years, he can learn a trade. He can become a barber, or maybe even an accountant, or maybe a carpenter. So this is what happens in those institutions. If we have time, I have a little clip that shows what happens in one juvenile institution and how how juveniles learn a specific trade. So the idea of developing literacy, cultural readiness, life skills is very strong. Does that answer your question? Sorry.
Morning. Thank you all. I appreciate the work that you do. It is wonderful. My question is, I too love the brain science. But the human face on mass incarceration in our young people. Prison is a mental and emotional devastation. And especially here in the state of Illinois, we're dealing with, in prison, we have so many people with mental illness. And they are part of the population. And our young men and women now, so many getting locked up, they have to face those types of people with mental illness perpetually as they mature, as they go through that long, devastating ordeal of being in prison. I'm saying that because I spent 15 years in prison. I was a young man, 20 years old, charged with the theory of accountability, meaning I was with someone who committed a crime, and I got charged with that. And in prison, you have to, the emotional ranges, the emotional devastation is not for our young people, because of looking at the brain science and the development of the mind as you went through, I'm a witness to that. And watching a young man, after the drugs wear off, after the alcohol wears off, after they have got some rest and relaxation from the harmful living environment and circumstances they were under, you see there standing before you someone who has been nursed back to their human sensitivities. And you say, yeah, that's what we want from you. That's what the world has always been waiting on. And after taking some GED classes and some academic courses and any kind of educational opportunities that present themselves, this young person now is in a condition to hold a meaningful, intelligent conversation. And it gets you excited. And you say, yeah. But the moment that excitement comes, it leaves because he got 60 years. The world will never see this person who has so much to offer, so much to contribute. And that is what we are dealing with our young people. And in my work, I'm an author actually. And I wrote a book on my 15-year prison experience that's in some of our schools here in the Chicago area and made mandatory reading for certain groups and in some of our universities. And in that work, I target our young people with the behaviors, with the harmful influences that they invite into their lives that will cause, especially here in America and in the state of Illinois, you are going to go to prison even if you did not commit a particular crime. And I see our young people sitting here in the front, and I'm really talking to you, not to the audience. The company you keep is real. Prison is a mental and emotional devastation, and it is perpetual. And you are going to come home to a world that did not exist after you left it. When I came home 3.5 years ago, I seen the internet for the first time in my life. I saw an email for the first time. A 5-year-old child had to teach me how to turn on the phone. She said, swipe it. So I waved it in the air. This is what you're going to deal with after a long prison sentence, and many men come home with no education, no work history, no work ethic, no social skills, no relationship skills. Fellas, you have no idea how to interact with women and children. And you're going to come home to a world that didn't exist when you left it. That is the combination that has to, I believe, go with your brain science. The brain science and then the heart science, that we understand what prison is and what it isn't. Thank you.
I think that's well said, and I wonder if the panelists want to add anything to that.
Yeah, if I can just add one quick thing. So I think you bring a particularly insightful perspective to this conversation. And I think one thing that I'll just put on the table is something that needs to happen going forward and is happening, but needs to happen on a broader level, is the inclusion of the voice of formerly incarcerated individuals. Because I think there is an insight and there is an experience that someone who hasn't been through that experience can add to the conversation. And so one of the things, for example, that the Bureau of Justice Assistance at BJA, at the Department of Justice, we have a visiting fellows program where folks come in, leaders in the field from a number of different disciplines come in, and BJA for the first year is soliciting for what they've called a second chance fellow, which is specifically for folks who have formerly incarcerated, who are now leaders in the field, either through education or advocacy, doing work in this area. And I think it is one person is not enough, but it is a recognition of the insight and power and importance of including the voice of formerly incarcerated or formerly justice-involved folks in this conversation and in terms of making the system better overall.
Can I just add something to that, Betsy? I agree. That's an incredibly powerful speech, so thank you very much. And in the people I've met in the UK who've been through the system can be I'm struck, moved to tears by what people say, how they say it, the eloquence, the way that they can portray and reflect on their own experiences. And one thing which we found really promising, there's some really good practice, and I don't know whether it happens here at all, is peer mentoring, so formal peer mentoring, and our gang exiting projects that I mentioned, people coming out of prison, that was all provided by ex-gang members who'd been through that mostly had been to prison themselves, sometimes for very long stretches. They'd decided they want to change their life, they've had training, they support other people, and as you say, I can talk all the good words in the world, but I haven't been through that experience, and so people have got an enormous amount. It's not just the waste of human life and the waste of human potential that we have when we send people to prison, but we're not using that even when they come out. And so I think the more we can do that and the more we can spread good practice, the better.
Can I make one super quick comment? In Madison, I work with the Madison Area Urban Ministries, and that's actually a group of, they have what's called the Circles of Support, and that's a group of ex-cons that help newly released convicts to reintegrate in society. So they have circles they meet every week, and they give counseling and all sorts of advice as to how to kind of better reintegrate. And I work with them, and they do wonderful work, and I only feel this should be state supported. This should not be a private endeavor.
We have 3 people lined up with questions. If you could limit your question to 1 minute, and we're going to try to move on to the next panel by quarter of stay on schedule. Okay, thank you.
So I have a question. You talked earlier, and we understand about and I support the evidence-based policy development, so using brain science as a foundation for policy development. And I think, Dr. Pipper, you said something about the fact that there are ways to enhance or accelerate brain development. I haven't seen any studies to that effect. I don't know if there are studies, and if so, I have 2 questions. One is, have there been studies in actually the ability to accelerate the prefrontal brain development, and if so, what are the conclusions that some of those studies have raised about what influences that acceleration?
Sure. So I was referencing work by Larry Steinberg. Referencing work by Larry Steinberg in his latest book, where he talks about the plasticity of the brain during young adulthood and the opportunity for both negative malleability and positive malleability. So I can't speak to specific scientific studies, but I know that this work is being done through adolescent development and brain science, and I'm sure the underlying study is there.
Okay. Yeah, did you have a question?
I mentioned a literature review that we commissioned, and that does cover that, and it'll point you towards to literature on maturation.
And was there a particular paper on your website that has that literature review in it?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Was there a particular paper on your website that had that literature review in it?
I'm sorry, I've got accent problem. I'm probably equally...
Is it, yeah.
What's the title of the paper?
Oh, the title of the paper.
Thank you for translating into English.
It was on my slide, maturity and dissonance. I can send it. I'll send it to Betsy, and it can.
Thank you.
Can send it around. Thank you. Yeah, it is on the website. Yes, all this is on the website.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Donald Hamilton. My brother, welcome home. You were the missing piece for that empty seat up on the panel. I came looking for more of a from experience type information that I could take back to my culture, my neighborhood, and my community as far as helping assist the young individuals that are wavering, because at some point they need just a vision of hope. And what I have found in dealing with them, I just completed volunteering over at the juvenile justice system, and what I have found is that the detachment of individuals that don't look like them, don't live like them, don't understand them. So at some point, the learning stops. It ceases and they shut down. Brett, this is more or less from experience when you mention brain, frontal lobe, and acceptance. The understanding of, have you been in a war? So when the children arrive in the system, they've been in a war. PTSD. It takes them a period of maybe 6 months to readjust as being normal. And what do you consider to be normal? Because daddy's not home, mom's is out doing whatever, and I'm at home by myself. Now, I've been diagnosed with a mental disorder, but I don't have the ability to get the medication or to stay on a timely period to let the medication take its total effect, because there's a time release in medication. So what is it that we can look forward to as part of a treatment process that would allow our children to maintain just normalcy coming back into the community?
Is that for you?
I'm happy. So I mean that's the $64 million question. I mean, that's a much bigger question, in my opinion, than the juvenile justice system or the criminal justice system or young adults who are involved in the justice system. I think that's a conversation that needs to happen, and we've talked about one small piece of that, which is when a young adult becomes justice involved, how should they be treated by the system, right? Not how they should be treated as an individual. I'll rescind that last statement, but how the system should respond to that individual. One part of your statement that really stuck out to me, though, is this process of we need to rehumanize people. And I think that's something that has been lost through this formalization of the criminal justice system. We talk about people as offenders, as convicts, as some other noun other than people, and people are people. And so I think as we rehumanize the system, and deal with the fact that a lot of the young people who are involved in our system have been victims themselves in past situations or have been exposed to traumatic situations, and we know that this trauma exists, and yet how do we respond to it? And so we need to be doing a better job of that. I think some of what we talked about today in terms of changing systems to be more responsive to young adults could hopefully help with that. But that's just one small piece of the conversation.
But I don't think that it addressed what I heard from the policy in the panel was that you were discussing in policies. Now I'm asking you about treating the person, the behavior, not the crime that was committed, but the behavior that led up to the crime is where it needs to be some changes.
Right.
So what I would request and ask of you, is it possible that I can network with you?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Gordi Stevic, and I'm originally from Serbia, so I'm a fellow European. So I just have my undergraduate is in a business degree, business administration here. I just have a question for all three of you. Would you say that this system right now is successful because 95% of the youth that are incarcerated right now have a mental illness? Treating mental illness is not really covered right now that well, even with the new Reform Health initiative. So individual with a mental illness is a liability, versus prison system is actually making profit for the communities. So it's more profitable for the communities and society in general to just keep the system going on, because prisons makes money, versus people when they're treated, they're on a losing end. So that's my question.
Well, I would push back just a little bit on the concept that prisons make money. I think states and county and cities are in financial distress in part because they've spent so much on prisons. And so, again,
for certain lawyers and like hotels, motels, it's like a booming industry. I was just reading that sometimes the towns will compete who's going to get a new prison.
That's right.
Because it's keeping the unemployment low, it's creating new jobs.
Right.
So.
I think it's a very broad, the thing is this is a very broad, almost like societal question. So we all know it's all under the term prison industrial, prison commercial complex. And how many percent of, what's the percentage of privately run prisons? 5, 10%, it's not that high. But however, there's good data. We know that since the 1980s, prison has become an industry, and that if you close the prison, the town around that prison will just, freak out because they're losing jobs. That's correct. To which extent prosecutors and judges have that in mind to feed the prison beast, I don't know, but it is you're perfectly right, it's a huge industry that is not taking care of the individual to the extent it probably should.
It's just a remark.
Thank you. I'm really sorry we have another speaker standing between us and those lunches in the back, so we're going to keep moving. I said the 3 more questions, that was the end of the questions. But there will be an opportunity as we go on through the day to continue this discussion. Thank you. And I just want to add, as Heather comes up here, there is a National Academy of Sciences report on mass incarceration, causes and consequences. I commend that to you. It is an extraordinary report and calls for the U.S. to dismantle the system of mass incarceration. So Heather, thank you. And speakers, big round of applause.